Does the word ladies make you feel unsafe? Students at Wolfson College, Cambridge, complained that they were made to feel unsafe by a photographer taking pictures at a matriculation ceremony. That's definitely not a word you want to get wrong, is it? How did he make them feel unsafe? He dared to ask male students to help the ladies get down from a raised platform. The students claimed it created an atmosphere of inequality. It's interesting, actually. I also went to university with several people who were afraid of the word ladies, but that was for very different reasons, I think. Anyway, Frank Furedi wrote about this in Spiked Online last week, and he joins me now. Thank you very much, Frank. Great to have you on the show. Now, what do you make of this story overall, then? You know, the idea now that potentially just using the word ladies can make some people feel unsafe.
But you have to remember that these days, feeling unsafe comes with the territory of university. A lot of people go to university and they've been educated into imagining that the world out there is very dangerous. And when you think in that kind of a way, then even the slightest criticism, anybody that puts a bit of pressure on you, is often interpreted as a threat to your very existence. And I've noticed last 15, 20 years in the universities that every single year, the academics give the impression that being in higher education is the most dangerous place in the world. And they often talk about rape culture. They talk about the fact that it's very unsafe for students here. And what it really is a kind of exaggerated, inflated sense of insecurity that's focused on every single word. And the second aspect of it, which is often not noted, is that when students kind of begin to think that being unsafe is like part of their identity, then they make a virtue out of it, and often they perform feeling insecure. So when they hear a word like ladies, instead of letting it go, instead of being generous and saying, well, we'll forgive the guy for saying this, instead of doing that, they say, oh yeah, I'm very unsafe, I feel threatened, and they make a big deal out of it. And I think that's...
Yeah, have we not got a problem here, Frank? Which is that actually, all too often, unfortunately, in our society, women are unsafe, and women do feel unsafe. And you could argue there's loads of times at universities, especially if there's a heavy drinking culture, a heavy drug-taking culture, where late at night, women might find themselves in very vulnerable situations, and indeed very dangerous situations, and those are unsafe. There are also just naturally dangerous people out there. And undoubtedly, some of those will work in the education system. There are stories as old as time itself of people in positions of power, i.e. lecturers or seminar tutors, abusing that position vis-à-vis some young women. But actually, does this now diminish the notion of what it means to be unsafe? So if someone just throws around, he called me a lady and now I feel unsafe, does that diminish what it actually means to be unsafe?
Well, it does, because we trivialize the threats, the real threats to our existence. And you have to remember that despite the scare stories that you hear now and again, by and large, life in higher education is really, really safe. When you look around, there's all these rules. People are very careful. They're very scared of even encroaching on each other's body space. And I think under those circumstances, what happens is you become addicted to being safe, which means that you can never feel safe. So the quest for safety becomes almost like a problem, because you continue looking for safety. And I don't know if you heard of the expression safe space, which is flourishing on campuses.
Yes.
But the very idea that people look for safe spaces means that they imagine that anything outside of that safe space is by default dangerous, unsafe. And I think under those circumstances, we trivialize the problems that confront us, and we almost make a virtue out of saying, well, I don't feel safe, just as a way of drawing attention to yourself. And I'm very critical, because what we're doing is we're ruining a whole generation of young people to the point at which they fail to make a distinction between the real threats and the problems of their own making.
Yeah, and we can't tell them, for want of a better phrase, to man up, can we? We can't tell them to grow a pair. We can't tell them that actually you're being a bit weak about this particular issue. You need to grow up. You need to learn to take some things on your chin. We can't do that, can we, unfortunately? Because it appears that whenever anyone goes to anyone else and says, I feel unsafe, I now want jazz handing instead of clapping because the loud noise can make me jump. I want all this stuff. I want everything to be a designated safe space. I want every single person in my lecture to have taken an unconscious bias exam and got 100% of it based on what my definition of, of white privilege means, for example. That cannot be the world that we want to live in, surely.
No, which is why I think people like you and me have got to use expressions like man up, even though that's called toxic masculinity.
Oh, you think we should?
And we have
to...
we should? I think we should be true to ourselves, and we should tell a 19, 20-year-old guy to get real and not just kind of sort of flatter them saying, oh, yeah, you're a poor little thing, you're very sensitive, I don't understand it. I think it's our job as adults to tell them that there's a real world out there and they need to have a bit of pressure put upon themselves. And they need to take themselves seriously instead of hiding behind these affectations of insecurity. I don't see why we shouldn't do that, because if we don't, then we become complicit in creating a culture where people become essentially paralyzed and unable to deal with the real challenges that confront them in everyday life.
OK, Frank, I'm going to, if it's all right with you, just bring in my superstar panel who've been here with me, listening diligently throughout the show. I'm going to go... There they are. Look at those. Look at those resplendent, wonderful faces. Jason Reed is UK lead at Young Voices and, of course, women's rights campaigner Kelly J. Keane and political commentator Andre Walker. Kelly, let's mix it up. Let's start with you. Have you got anything you particularly would like to ask to Frank, who's here now?
Yeah, Frank, clearly this problem is in universities, but it starts way before that. What do you think schools for younger children can actually do to foster a little bit of resilience in the kids?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think the real problem kicks in when they're 9, 10, 11, and what schools do is that instead of challenging young kids and stretching them and cultivating their capacity for independence, we almost try to validate them. So I remember when my son used to go to school, he'd come back every single day with 20 smiley faces. And you think that he was like the nicest boy in the world. But all that was happening is that he was never criticized. He was never questioned. He was never put under any pressure. And like all the other children, as a result of that, they become unable to really deal with pressure, deal with the challenges of everyday life. And I think what we're doing is instead of cultivating their capacity for freedom and for being active, what we're doing is we're making them powerless, and we're telling them it's a difficult world, you're vulnerable, you're weak, you're powerless, we're here to help you. And every time I talk to a teacher, they always say, we're here to give you support. Actually, the last thing that kids need is support. What they need is to be stretched a little bit. What they need to be stimulated and encouraged to stand on their 2 feet.
Andre, anything from you?
Yeah, why is it always the absolute hounds at university that are into this sort of stuff? Look, and I make that as a serious point. People who actually seem to have fun at university, have friends at university, are on the more attractive end and not interested, whereas it's the marginal people who just, I think, cause trouble.
Well, unfortunately, what used to be the marginal people are now in the mainstream. And I think the administration and universities have brought in all these rules and regulations, which make it very difficult to be normal, to be relaxed, to be spontaneous, to kind of banter and to, sort of give and take and to, sort of discover each other. And what has happened is that because of the new rules that have been brought in, people are really wary of coming close to one another, of getting it on with one another in the way that universities used to be like. And as a result of that, we've all become the marginal characters have become the role models for all of us, which has become a little bit unfortunate.
Yeah. And Jason, what's your take on this? Have you got any questions?
Well, Frank, we hear a lot of these kinds of stories, don't we, of students overreacting to something innocuous someone said or cancelling an event with a controversial guest. But don't you think that some of this is just students adapting to the world there? I mean, a lot of these are very, very young people. We're talking about 18, 19-year-old people here, and they're entering adult life for the first time. They're reacting, possibly overcorrecting for issues that they see in the wider world. And then as they get older and they gain a bit more life experience, some of those more radical elements might just drain away by themselves, meaning it's not really a problem for wider society.
Well, I think the problem is never the students. I think the students are the product of an education system, a school system that disempowers them when they get to university. I think the problem is the university administration that flatters them and infantilizes them. Instead of treating them like young men and young women, they treat them like, girls and boys, which is, horrible. And I think that as a result of it, what happens is that people can spend 3-4 years in a university, and when they leave, instead of being able to stand on their 2 feet and think for themselves, they still become fairly dependent on people around them and looking for support all the time. And to me, the tragedy is that when you talk to employers, when they get these young kids coming into to the workplace, they bring with them all the baggage that's been imposed upon them by the education system. So for us, and in a sense, the problem is not the students, they're great, and many of them are absolutely fantastic. The real problem is the institutions, which institutionalize a sense of powerlessness and encourage young students to be obsessed with their identity and to be obsessed with their gender and their sexuality, instead of making them aware of their accomplishment, of what they can achieve with their 2 hands. And that, to me, as an academic, is a real tragedy, something I'm really committed to challenging, because our job as educators is to cultivate people's capacity for independence and standing on your 2 feet, rather than being, somehow this kind of powerless, dependent individual.
And also, presumably as well, not creating the idea or the notion that anyone of a certain age is now no longer worth listening to because they're outdated and they're behind the times. It seems to me as though we're losing a lot of the accumulated wisdom of people of a certain generation in this nation because we're giving in to the whims, the rather pathetic whims, in my opinion, of some of the people in a younger generation. Would you go with that, Frank?
Absolutely. I remember I was giving a lecture in New York just before the first lockdown, and I got into an argument with these American students. And this woman comes up to me and says, Frank, you're old, you just don't get it. And I just said, actually, I do get it, but I think you're wrong. And I just think that what we got to do is, instead of being defensive about it, explain to them that we have a knowledge, you have a knowledge, let's have a dialogue with each other, and don't try to treat us like children, because we have experience that you could learn from just as much as we can learn from you and your kind of youthful kind of experiences.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.